Hercule Poirot and the Painting That Forgot, Its Colour, Chapter 1, A Colourless Echo at the Winterly Gallery. Lady Eugenia Winterly held her glass of sherry with the same icy grace with which she had ruled her household for more than 3 decades. Dusk cast shadows over the windows of her stately country residence on the shores of Lake Windermere, and a faint murmur permeated the grand drawing-room of the main gallery, where a select group of guests were admiring the paintings of her late husband, the celebrated Impressionist painter Harold Winterly. The centrepiece of the evening was The Crimson Whisper, a large-format oil painting recently returned to the family after years on display at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Paris. However, when it was unrolled by guest curator Alton Finch, a disconcerting silence fell over the room. "What is this?" Lady Eugenie muttered, with a hint of disbelief. The painting, famous for its vivid explosion of reds and oranges, appeared almost completely devoid of colour. What should have been vibrant brushstrokes were now faded smudges, as if time had absorbed their essence. Only one corner retained some of its original hue, a small crimson flower at the feet of a nearly erased female figure. This is impossible," Mr. Finch stammered, pale as marble. "We packed it under perfect conditions with controlled temperature and humidity. There's no logical explanation." The young art critic Lionel Gray scrutinized the canvas with narrowed eyes, clearly more intrigued than horrified. "A fraud," he whispered behind his wine-glass. "Or perhaps a deliberate act." The atmosphere became tense. Lady Eugenie demanded silence. No one dared to move. At that moment, a maid came running in, pale and trembling. "My lady, it's Mr. Rupert. He's in the greenhouse." The sentence hung in the air until several guests ran out into the gardens. Winterly Hall's greenhouse, an Italian-style glass dome surrounded by centuries-old rose bushes, was locked from the inside. They had to break a side panel to get in. Rupert Dane, art restorer and protégé of Lady Eugenie, lay dead beside the marble bench. In his lap he still held epaulettes stained with deep red. "My God!" Lady Eugenie moaned, choking back a sob. "It can't be. He wasn't. He was just a child." A family doctor, who happened to be present, confirmed the death poison, probably ingested of his own volition. Or so it seemed. Hours later, the local police had cordoned off the area, and the first rumours were woven like cobwebs in the corners of the gallery. Lady Eugenia, still serene despite the tragedy, addressed the district inspector in an unusually firm voice. "Call Hercule Poirot. I don't accept assumptions when my husband's honour and the life of an innocent boy are at stake. Someone has played both of them, and I need the best to understand what this game is." 2 days later, Hercule Poirot. He stepped out of a black car outside Winterly Hall Gardens. He was impeccably dressed in a pearl-grey coat, carrying a mother-of-pearl-handled walking stick and perfectly waxed moustache. Beside him, Captain Hastings, with his classic blend of scepticism and loyalty, was observing the landscape with interest. "A painting that loses its colour, Poirot, and a young man who dies without explanation. Doesn't that seem a little theatrical?" Poirot tilted his head thoughtfully. "My friend, the human soul is the greatest stage of all. When someone intentionally alters a work of art, it's not just paint they're manipulating. It's a message. And that dead boy isn't the final act. No, Hastings, this is merely the curtain that opens." As they crossed the threshold of the gallery, Poirot's eyes immediately fell upon the pale painting. Ah, the Crimson Whisper. "And now you've forgotten your voice?" Inspector Mallory, with a rugged appearance and a reddish beard, greeted the detective with a somewhat brusque gesture. "There's not much to see, Monsieur Poirot. Everything points to suicide. The young man was alone, the doors were locked from the inside, and he had a history of emotional instability. As for the condition, some chemical defect, I suppose." Poirot smiled gently. "And you are satisfied with appearances, Monsieur l'Inspecteur?" Mallory frowned. "Don't you?" Poirot raised an eyebrow as his fingers lightly touched the faded surface of the canvas. "Never, sir, because appearances often lie elegantly." And with that phrase, Hercule Poirot began his investigation. Chapter 2. The Circle Under the Gas Lamp. The tea room at Winterly Hall, decorated with Victorian furniture and a central gas lamp that flickered with the slightest movement of air, served that morning as a makeshift interview room. Poirot, sitting upright with a barely sipped cup of tea in front of him, meticulously examined not only the words of those present, but also the pauses between them, the half-suppressed sighs, and the nervous gestures. Beside him, Hastings took notes with military punctuality. "Let's start with those present on the night of the event, if you please," Poirot told Inspector Mallory, who had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to let him conduct the interrogations. 7 people plus Lady Eugenie and the household staff, Mallory said, flipping through her notebook. The critic Lionel Gray, the curator Alton Finch, Miss Daphne Winterly, Lady Eugenie's niece, Dr. Basil Crane, Mrs. Cordelia Harper, a family friend, Colonel Archibald Wilton, and Miss Lily Merriweather, the art governess. All were formal guests. Poirot nodded gravely. "Okay, so we start with Mr. Gray, right?" The young art critic entered with a casual air. His dark curls fell over his forehead, and a faint scent of bergamot enveloped him. He sat down uninvited, crossed his legs, and studied Poirot's face, as if evaluating it for an exhibition. "A strange night," he began. "Although, personally, I never believed that the Crimson Whisper deserved his fame. Harold Winterly had technique, yes, but he lacked fire. Perhaps it was the painting that died of boredom, not Rupert." "Did you know young Dane well?" Poirot asked gently. "Not much," Gray replied, shrugging. "Pretty intense, always talking about restoring the soul of painting, like some museum priest. I thought it was excessive." Poirot didn't reply immediately. His eyes fell on the hematite ring Gray wore on his little finger. "And where were you when they found him dead?" "On the veranda with other guests, although I admit I went out to the patio for a moment to smoke. Just a few minutes." Poirot exchanged a fleeting glance with Hastings. "Thank you, sir. I'll call you if necessary." Lionel Gray walked away with an enigmatic smile. The next to pass was Alton Finch, the curator, still visibly upset. "Mr. Poirot, nothing like this has ever happened to me. The painting was intact when we left Paris. Packed it myself. It was framed with anti-glare glass, in a sealed wooden box with all the necessary care." "And you unpacked it yourself?" Poirot asked. "Did anyone present touch the canvas before the exhibition?" "No, no one, just me. except, well, Rupert helped me secure it to the stand. He insisted on checking the frame. He said he noticed something odd. I didn't see anything. And how did you react when you saw the colourless painting? Like everyone else, stunned, but not alarmed. He seemed almost resigned, as if he'd been expecting it. Hastings frowned, but Poirot remained unperturbed. He made a brief note in his notebook. The next to enter was the young woman Daphne Winterly, the hostess's niece. With light hair and a sweet face, she wore black out of respect for the deceased, although her mourning didn't seem to weigh heavily on her gestures. "He was a friend of mine," she said, almost without emotion. "Rupert was a sensitive soul. Too much for this world. Even if my aunt doesn't say so, we all knew he adored her." "Requited love?" asked Poirot. Daphne looked down. "No," she considered, "him almost like a son." "Where were you when the tragedy occurred?" "In the adjoining parlour, with Mrs. Harper and the Colonel. We were listening to music from the gramophone. I thought Rupert just needed some air. And what did you think of the painting? That someone had deliberately destroyed it. My uncle didn't paint things that would disappear. He painted memories, emotions. They don't evaporate like that." After a pause, Poirot asked, "Do you know if Rupert had received any threats? Was he worried?" "I don't know," Daphne replied, though she hesitated only for a moment. "But he left me a note last night. He said that if anything happened, don't trust. The obvious, that was all." Poirot exchanged a tense look with Hastings. It was, at last, a loose thread. The interrogation continued with the Mrs. Cordelia Harper, elegant and distant, who went out of his way to assure us that he barely knew the deceased young man. Then the Coronel Wilton, who seemed more interested in discussing the Scotch served during the evening than in the crime itself. Finally, Lily Merriweather. The art governess, trembling and visibly frightened, declared that she had not left her room after dinner. When the last of them had left, Poirot leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes and murmured, "What kind of boy writes a cryptic note before he dies, and still commits suicide?" Hastings responded uncertainly. Maybe it was just a dramatic gesture. Poirot shook his head. "No, my friend, it's a warning. And this warning, like the painting, has lost some of its colour, but not its message." He stood up and walked slowly toward the gallery, leaving Hastings behind. "Sometimes, Hastings," he said without turning around, "a painting without colour can say more than one brimming with pigment, especially if the culprit has forgotten that absence is also a presence." Chapter 3. The Frame Without Image. The next. Morning dawned, covered in a thick fog that enveloped the gardens of Winterly Hall like a shroud. Poirot, faithful to his routine, was already impeccably dressed, adjusting the pleats of his gloves while Hastings finished tying his shoes by the window. "Don't you think we should wait until the fog clears?" Hastings asked, visibly worried. "You can barely make out the garden hedges." "My friend, when the outside becomes cloudy, one must look within," Poirot replied, without raising his voice. "It is this fog that sometimes reveals what was previously unnoticed. Today we will observe the frame. From the painting, not only that, the framework of the events of human relationships. When you strip away the image everyone sees, what remains is the structure, and there, Hastings, lies the crime." The two of them headed toward the late Harold Winterly's private studio, now closed since his death, but which Lady Eugenie had authorized to be opened for the investigation. The room, scented with antique, wax and wood dust, contained dozens of stacked frames, sketches, paintbrushes petrified by time, and in one corner a sheet-covered easel. Poirot approached, slowly lifted the cloth, and revealed an unfinished canvas. "It hasn't been touched for years," said Hastings. "What exactly are you looking for, Poirot?" Who better to know the secrets of a painter than his works? This painting is incomplete, but not empty. It's a sketch of Daphne. Look at the gesture of her hand, the profile of her face. There's no colour, only lines. Yet it conveys, what would you say, Hastings? Somewhat tense, as if he were resisting. "Exactly," Poirot agreed. "A work of art doesn't lie. Not entirely. And it seems to me that Monsieur Harold Winterly wasn't as naive as has been said. Look here." Poirot pointed to a scribble in the corner of the canvas, an initial drawn in ink rather than paint. "An R," Hastings said. Rupert and Poirot remained silent. Then he turned to the desk, where he discovered a leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with coloured notes, dates, titles, and among them a circled name, Palette number 27, back of frame. Poirot raised his eyebrows. "This refers to the Crimson Whisper Curious, isn't it?" Harold left instructions on the back of the painting, which then faded. "I wonder if anyone else knew this." Before Hastings could respond, a knock at the door interrupted the moment. It was young Lily Merriweather. "Monsieur Poirot, excuse me, but I found this hidden among the books in the East Wing. I didn't know if it was important." It was a grey cardboard folder. Opening it, Poirot revealed several handwritten letters, all addressed to Rupert. They were unsigned but were recently dated. The content was disturbing. "You don't understand what that painting means. Someone is willing to do whatever it takes to keep you quiet. Don't touch the frame. Burn it if you can." Poirot read silently, then looked up. "Mademoiselle, why did you decide to bring me this?" "I couldn't keep it in. Rupert trusted me, but I was scared by what he said last night. He said I wouldn't die for an empty frame. I didn't know what he meant." Poirot placed the letters thoughtfully on the desk. "Thank you, Miss Merriweather." "You did well." When she left, Poirot closed the folder and turned to Hastings. "Do you see, mon ami?" Everyone thought Rupert was obsessed with restoring a painting, when in fact what he was trying to do was discover what someone else had hidden behind it. Behind the canvas? Poirot nodded. "Yes. Remember what Curator Finch mentioned?" Rupert insisted on examining the stretcher. Not the painting, the stretcher. And what did we find today? That Harold left a specific reference to the back of the painting in his notes. And now that same painting has been bleached, and its stretcher hasn't even been examined by anyone yet. That afternoon, with the help of Inspector Mallory, who was already beginning to doubt his hasty diagnosis of suicide, Poirot inspected the frame of the Crimson Whisper alone. They carefully removed the canvas with gloves, and there, engraved on the interior wood, they discovered the unthinkable. A signature clearly different from that of Harold Winterly. This is a fake!" Mallory exclaimed, his mouth agape. "But not," Poirot corrected. "It's a confession, a work hidden within another, a painting within a painting. someone switched the original for a copy, but Rupert found out, and that was his mistake. Poirot ran his fingers over the engraved signature. "CAW," he read softly. 3 initials, and none of them is Harold Winterly. Hastings was confused. So the painting wasn't Harold's? And Rupert knew about it? Poirot replied in a deep voice, and he died for not silencing it. As the detective began mentally jotting down the names of everyone in the house, whose initials might match, his gaze hardened. Now it's all come down to this: a hidden name, and the true colour of lies. Chapter 4. 3 initials and a shadow. Night fell again over Winterly Hall, with a dense, almost ominous silence. The chandeliers cast long shadows in the corridors, and the house seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew the truth was beginning to creep into its foundations. In Lady Eugenie's private office, Poirot was leafing through a notebook of names and correspondence, while Hastings, still fascinated by the discovery of the frame, hovered impatiently near the fire. "So," Hastings said, finally breaking the silence, "we have 3 letters, C, A, and W, and none of them belong to Harold Winterly. Does that confirm that the painting was replaced?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Not necessarily, my friend. Editititgain could mean that the original painting was signed by someone else before Harold adopted it, or that this work was a hidden collaboration. The important thing is not only who signed it, but because that signature was hidden under layers of paint, and why it has now come to light just as Rupert dies." Poirot closed the notebook with a soft click and looked towards the fireplace. "And what do you think of this name, Hastings? CAW, 3 initials. Let's see who in this house could fit those letters." Hastings thought for a few seconds. "Well, there's Cordelia Harper, but there's no W. Alton Finch either. Daphne Winterly, it could be W, but she's missing the other letters." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet, there is a name that the house murmurs, even though no one pronounces it. Clara Annabel Winterly. Harold's wife? No, his sister. She died 20 years ago under unclear circumstances. She was a painter too, though Harold was said to have never taken her seriously. A dangerous amateur, he called her in an interview. According to records, she lived in a small cabin on the eastern grounds until her death. No one mentions her, but she's listed in the archives. Curious, isn't it?" Hastings frowned. "Are you saying the painting could be her work? Or at least in part? What if Harold took your work and signed it as his own? What if Rupert discovered that truth when analysing the frame?" A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the governess, Lily Merriweather, who was visibly upset. "Monsieur Poirot, I don't know if I should say this, but I've remembered something. When Rupert arrived a few months ago, he spent a lot of time in the old library, looking through the family letters. And one day he showed me a portrait. Not of Lady Eugenie, not of Daphne. It was a woman I didn't recognize. He said it was Clara, Annabel Winterly. Poirot watched her closely. And what happened to that portrait? I haven't seen him again, but I remember Rupert calling him the painting that should not exist." Poirot stood up immediately. "Come on, Hastings. To the library. Now, the Winterly Hall Library was a sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and aged papers. In the farthest corner, behind a sliding partition, Poirot discovered a small, barely noticeable wooden door. The lock was carefully forced. Inside, a dusty room opened like a forgotten reliquary. A desk, an oil lamp, and on the back wall, covered by a thick sheet, an oil portrait. Poirot withdrew the cloth with almost ceremonial slowness. It was a portrait of a young woman with loose brown hair, serious eyes, and a melancholic expression. At the bottom of the painting was a small gold plaque. Clara A. Winterly, 1909. Signed, Poirot murmured. And not by Harold. Indeed, in the lower right corner, a signature appeared. C.A.W. The same line as the frame. Poirot confirmed. So Harold stole your work. And the fame, we can't say for sure yet. But Rupert, upon discovering this connection, must have understood that there was something fishy about the origin of the painting everyone admired, and if the painting in question, The Crimson Whisper, was also partly Clara's work, which would have called into question Harold's entire legacy. Poirot examined the portrait frame and, wearing gloves, extracted a small envelope that had been slipped between the canvas and the wood. He opened it carefully. Inside, a letter, short, written in faded ink. To whoever finds this, if my work ever comes to light, you'll know I didn't go quietly. Signed it with what was denied me, my name, not for glory, but for the truth. C.A.W. Hastings was stunned. Do you mean that all of this death, the faded painting, the letters, it all revolves around a woman that no one remembers? Poirot nodded gravely. Exactly. A ghost without a grave, but with a brush. She covered the portrait with the sheet again and looked at Hastings determinedly. Now we understand because it remains to be seen who he found out that Rupert was going to reveal this, and decided to keep quiet about it forever. The shadow of the crime lengthened, but Poirot already saw the silhouette of the culprit among the strokes of a lost painting. Chapter 5. The Ghost in the Frame. The wind rustled through the trees of the East Garden as Poirot and Hastings emerged from the hidden library. Behind them, the portrait of Clara Annabel Winterly remained hidden once more, a silent and forgotten witness. The air had changed. Something invisible but definite had shifted in the atmosphere of Winterly Hall. The crime was no longer simply the death of Rupert Dane, but the death of a truth buried for decades. And yet, Hastings, Poirot murmured as they descended the stairs to the north wing, we mustn't be hasty. What we've learned is crucial, yes, but we still don't know who had the most to lose by revealing the truth, and therefore who might have wished to silence Rupert. Lady Eugenia, perhaps, Hastings ventured. If her brother had stolen works from his own sister, and she knew it. An interesting motive, but she was the one who allowed us to investigate. No, there's a figure who hides more cunningly, someone whose shadow walks this house silently. At that moment appeared Colonel Archibald Wilton, impeccable in his wool jacket and military cane, watching Poirot with some suspicion. Mr. Poirot, he said in a gravelly voice, I heard you were wandering around the forbidden wings of the house, looking for ghosts. Only those who left their mark, Poirot replied evenly. Then you've got the wrong era. Dead people don't paint pictures, you know. Poirot inclined his head. And yet There are dead people who speak louder than the living. Tell me, Colonel, did you know Clara Winterly?" Wilton seemed surprised by the mention. "Of course, we all knew her. She was eccentric, talented, yes, but emotionally volatile. She couldn't bear Harold's success. They said his death was an accident, although some believed it was intentional. You know, artistic sensibility." Poirot looked at him closely. "And what do you think?" "I think the past should stay where it is." Poirot merely nodded with a neutral smile, and the Colonel left without further comment. "Have you noticed, Hastings?" Poirot said later, as they resumed their tour of the house. "The Colonel said, 'We all knew her.' And yet, not once in 3 days has her name escaped his notice, until today. Maybe he didn't want to stir up trouble. Or maybe he didn't want anyone will remember too much." Later, in the small dining room, Poirot discreetly summoned Daphne Winterly. The young woman, still dressed in black, entered silently. This time without makeup. She seemed more fragile than the first time they saw her, as if a veil of anxiety enveloped her. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot delicately, "why did you never mention your Aunt Clara?" Daphne was silent for a few moments. "Because scandals aren't discussed in this house. My grandmother erased her name from her letters. Lady Eugénie only mentions her when she's alone and doesn't know we're listening. Harold erased her from his story. Did you know that Clara was an artist?" "Yes," Daphne said, looking down. "Rupert figured it out. He found some of your sketches among the inheritance books, and comparing them to Harold's earlier works, they were the same. Even the Crimson Whisperet was a reinterpretation of one of her designs. Rupert became obsessed with the idea that Harold had appropriated his art, and when he found the signed stretcher, he realized it was true." Poirot nodded. "And you think that justifies his death?" "No!" Daphne exclaimed, her gaze rising with sudden force. "He just wanted justice for someone who could no longer defend himself. He told me he'd keep it a secret until he was sure that I had to find something else. 'A second painting,' he told. 'It's me one that would prove royal authorship.'" Poirot leaned towards her, his eyes shining with interest. "A second painting?" "Yes, a self-portrait of Clara. He believed it was hidden on the property, perhaps in the cabin where she lived. No one has entered it since she died. It's been boarded up for 20 years. Poirot stood up gently. "Then, mademoiselle, the time has come to go to the source." Lantern in hand, accompanied by Hastings and Inspector Mallory, Poirot arrived that evening at the cottage in the eastern woods. The bricks of the door were cracked with age. Mallory opened it with difficulty, and a gust of old dust and dampness greeted him. The interior was gloomy, but clearly retained the spirit of an artist. Dry brushes, rolled papers, an easel still standing in the most moonlit corner, and there, covered by an aged linen blanket, a large format canvas. Poirot solemnly removed the cloth. It was a self-portrait of Clara Annabel Winterly. She was young, determined, her gaze directed directly at the viewer, and in the corner, her signature CAW. "It's her," Hastings whispered. "There's no doubt about it." Poirot nodded silently. Then he carefully turned the painting over. In the back, there was a small hidden compartment with a missing nail. Inside, they found a waxed paper envelope. He opened it. It contained a letter and a photograph. The letter said, "Red isn't just a colour. It's the trace of what was taken from me. If this painting is ever seen, let them know I existed, even if they denied me." The photograph showed an early version of the Crimson Whisper, signed by Clara, with the same stroke as the frame. "This is the second painting," Poirot said quietly. "The final proof, and with it, the final motive." "Motive for whom?" Hastings asked. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He carefully put the letter and the photograph away, then murmured, "For someone who built his entire life on a lie, and who couldn't allow anyone, not even an enthusiastic young man, to discover the first trace of the truth." Chapter 6. A Lie, signed in red. The mist from the forest was just beginning to dissipate when Poirot, Hastings, and Inspector Mallory returned to Winterly Hall, still carrying Clara's carefully wrapped self-portrait. The main hall greeted them with its usual stately coldness. But something had changed. The house was no longer just the scene of a crime, but of a disrupted legacy, a effaced identity begging to be restored, brushstroke by brushstroke. "And now, Poirot," said Mallory, drying his hands with a handkerchief, "we have proof that Clara painted The Crimson Whisper, but is that enough to explain the death of the young restaurateur?" "Not yet, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," replied Poirot. "We've found the motive, yes, but the subtlest element is missing, the human reaction to the discovery. Who knew what Rupert was going to do? Who had access to the painting in the days leading up to it? And who had the knowledge to manipulate a canvas without leaving any trace, except the loss of colour? Are you implying that it was damaged on purpose?" "I'm right for you, Inspector. It wasn't a chemical accident. It was a warning. Removing the colour was like silence a voice without breaking it completely. And only someone with a message to send would do that." In the middle of the morning, Poirot requested a private meeting with Alton Finch, the curator of the Parisian Museum. The man arrived with a haggard face and a barely concealed expression of alarm. "Monsieur Poirot, you've discovered something, haven't you?" "Let's just say I've begun to distinguish the true lines of the portrait," the detective said with a slight smile. "And what I see intrigues me. Tell me, Monsieur Finch, since when did you know that The Crimson Whisper was not entirely the work of Harold Winterly?" Finch opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Poirot continued more firmly. "Rupert wrote to you, right? He showed you sketches, maybe even the signature. You understood the implications. A forgery, a historical betrayal. Your reputation as a curator would be tarnished if it became known that you had been exhibiting a stolen work for years." "No!" Finch exclaimed, throwing up his hands. "I didn't kill Rupert. I didn't say he did it, but he did know, and he didn't stop him. Tell me, who else knew?" The silence stretched on. Finally, Finch whispered, "Lionel Gray. The critic? Yes. He and Rupert had a constant argument. Rupert accused him of wanting to publicly discredit him. Lionel said everything Rupert claimed was revisionist mythology. And then the threats started." "Threats?" "Rupert showed me a note. It was typed, 'Give up, or you'll be the next faded painting.' I thought it was a cruel joke." "He didn't." Poirot was silent for a few seconds. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. That was helpful." Lionel Gray appeared shortly after in the gallery, impeccably dressed, as if he knew he was about to be summoned. He looked at the faces present with disdain. "A private inquisition, Poirot?" "A necessary conversation," the Belgian replied calmly. "Tell me about your relationship with Rupert Dane." Relationship? He was an amateur with delusions of grandeur. He sought to rewrite art history, to glorify a woman who had been dead for decades. A hopeless romantic. Poirot took a step towards him. "And you threatened him?" Gray smiled with a spark of arrogance. "I have no need for threats. Time disarms the naive." "And does manipulating a canvas, erasing its original colour, require more time than intention?" Gray blinked. For the first time he hesitated. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Because you, Mr. Gray, were one of the few who touched the painting before the exhibition, and also the only one with sufficient technical knowledge to alter the pigments using a colourless chemical compound that, when dried, decomposes the oil dyes without damaging the frame." Hastings looked at him, astonished. "Is that possible?" Poirot nodded without taking his eyes off Gray. "For a restoration expert, yes. Especially if he wants to create a scandal without leaving direct evidence of sabotage. Lionel wanted to discredit Rupert without getting his hands dirty. But Rupert didn't back down. And then he died." Gray leaned forward, almost defiantly. "That doesn't prove I killed him." Poirot smiled, not proudly, but gravely. "No, monsieur, but science can. In the palette Rupert was holding when he died, the police found traces of the same chemical compound that breaks down pigments. But it wasn't in the jars in his study. Do you know where it was found? In his bedroom, Monsieur Gray. In an unlabeled jar mixed with his illustration ink." Gray paled. "It's not poison," he murmured. "But when it came into contact with the hot drink Rupert was drinking," Poirot continued, "it triggered a toxic reaction, silent, painful, seemingly natural. There was absolute silence." Then Poirot turned to the inspector. "Inspector Mallory, I believe you have enough to formally question Monsieur Gray for premeditated poisoning, tampering with evidence, and murder." Gray said nothing more. He just sank into the nearest chair, staring at the colourless painting as if he finally understood its true meaning. That evening, Poirot returned to the gallery alone. Under the dim light, he gazed at the now empty frame. A stolen painting. "Oh, denied signature, a senseless death," he whispered. "And yet the truth returns. It always returns, even if it's blank." Chapter 7. The Voice That Didn't Paint. Winterley Hall dawned in a tense calm. Lionel Gray had been placed under provisional arrest, while Inspector Mallory organised the formal documentation. The discovery of the chemical compound in his room and the obvious motive were solid pieces of the case. But for Poirot, something still didn't quite fit. It wasn't that he doubted Gray's guilt in tampering with the painting, but that Rupert's death still had inexplicable nuances. "Hastings," said Poirot, as they sat at breakfast in the conservatory, where the death had occurred only a few days before. "Tell me, don't you think that Monsieur Gray had many ways of discrediting Rupert without resorting to murder?" "Well, yes," Hastings replied thoughtfully. "I could have published a column A critique even discredited him socially, but perhaps I thought Rupert had too much evidence. Yes, and yet there's something else. Grey was cruel, arrogant but not desperate, and murder, Hastings, requires desperation or absolute coldness. And I don't yet see that coldness in him. I see theatre, but not precision. Hastings looked up. Do you think there's another one? I don't rule it out, mon ami, especially after what Lady Eugenie handed me this morning. Poirot opened an envelope on the table. Inside, a letter written in shaky handwriting. Mr. Poirot, this letter was found among Rupert's belongings. I'm leaving it with you because I think you'll know what to do with it. It's unsigned, but I recognize that handwriting. E.W. Poirot unfolded the sheet and began to read aloud. Rupert, please stop. You don't understand the danger of digging further. It's not just the past you're disturbing, but people who still have power. They won't allow it. What you found on the stretcher frame isn't the worst. The real secret is in the missing painting. In the painting that was never hung. If you love this house, if you love me, burn what you have. And be silent. Hastings frowned. Did Daphne write that? Poirot nodded gravely, and he wrote it with emotion, not out of greed, out of fear. And there's a key phrase. The painting that was never hung. The self-portrait. No, another one. We haven't seen it yet. That afternoon, Poirot asked, to meet Lady Eugenie in the portrait room. She received him seated in her usual velvet armchair, dressed in charcoal grey, her face as serene as a carved figure. Monsieur Poirot, have you come to accuse me? No, madam. I just wanted to ask you something that only you can know. Was there ever a painting of Clara that your brother never allowed to exhibit? A long silence. Yes, she said finally. His name was Nobody's Voice, a dark, disturbing oil painting. Clara painted it at the end, when her mental health was beginning to deteriorate. It showed a figure from behind, faceless, in an empty place. It was disturbing. Harold refused to hang it. He said it tainted his legacy. He hid it. I thought it had burned, but I suspect Rupert found it. Poirot stood up. So there's still one more truth to be revealed. One that someone still fears. Lady Eugenia looked at him with eyes full of melancholy. And what will you do when you find her, Monsieur Poirot? I'll hang her, he said, the way justice is hung. Guided by old plans of the house, Poirot and Hastings returned that night to the cellar beneath the west wing. There, among forgotten shelves and dusty boxes, they found a hidden compartment behind a false wooden wall. Upon opening it, the stale air escaped like a sigh held for decades. And there, wrapped in 3 layers of linen and sealed with wax, a painting without a frame. Poirot held him up to the light of his lantern. Hastings stepped back. My God! The image was powerful and dark. A female figure with her back turned, featureless, shrouded in shadows, in an almost dreamlike setting. But that wasn't what was shocking. It was the background. Behind the figure, almost imperceptible at first glance, a series of silhouettes, like faceless judges, in black robes and with paintbrushes instead of hands. It's an accusation, Poirot whispered, against those who silenced her, against her brother, her family, the art world. Clara wasn't mad. She was furious. On the back of the canvas, an inscription in red paint. "This is what they see when they don't hear me. Clara A. Winterly." Poirot exhaled deeply. "Now I understand everything. Rupert wasn't killed just because of what he discovered. He was killed by what I was about to show the world. And there's one person who knew about this painting. One who saw it before him. One who's already lied enough." "Who?" Hastings asked tensely. Poirot lowered the painting and looked at his friend with a sadness he rarely showed. "Daphne Winterly." Chapter 8. Shadows in the Blood Brush. The sky above Winterly Hall darkened earlier than usual, as if the day knew something grim was about to reveal itself. Inside the mansion, Poirot walked silently down the central corridor, the recovered canvas carefully wrapped under his arm. Hastings followed with uncertain steps, glancing at the family portraits that seemed to watch them from the walls with growing unease. "Are you sure, Poirot?" Hastings finally asked in a low voice. "Daphne." "Miss Daphne Winterly," Poirot said without pausing, "is the missing piece. Not out of malice, but out of love, out of desperation, and out of a misunderstood promise that headed straight for the yellow drawing-room, where Lady Eugenie had arranged a discreet soirée for her permanent guests. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. Daphne, dressed in ivory with a fine silver chain around her neck, watched them from a corner with a serene but expectant expression. Poirot greeted her politely. "Mademoiselle Daphne, I was wondering if we could talk for a moment, privately." Daphne nodded without hesitation. She accompanied him to the library, where the portrait of her Aunt Clara still rested under its white sheet. Poirot placed the new canvas on the table and slowly removed the linen covering it. The young woman looked at him in silence. "So you found it," he said finally. "Yes," replied Poirot, the voice of nobody. "The painting Rupert was looking for, the one you already knew from before." Daphne swallowed, but didn't take her eyes off the painting. "I found it by accident months ago. Clara's cabin was always a forbidden place, but one night, driven by curiosity, I went in. The painting was there, untouched, and it was devastating. I felt watched, judged, because she was Mademoiselle. Clara painted this painting as a condemnation, not as a work to be admired. And you understood. You knew that if Rupert made it public, Harold's legacy, his family's, this entire house's, would crumble. And he didn't understand what that meant," Daphne exclaimed with sudden fervour. "Not just for art history, for my aunt, for my grandmother, for me. This house stands on names, on prestige, on recognition. And what would Rupert do? Unearth a ghost to glorify it and sully all the others?" Poirot watched her steadily, without judgment. "Were you the one who altered the painting?" "No, that was Lionel. I know it now. He told me in a letter I received later. But I did something worse." She walked to the window and hugged herself. "When Rupert told me about the second painting, about how he planned to take it to the museum and display it alongside the signed stretcher, I begged him to stop. I told him they wouldn't understand, that they would call him an impostor, that he would destroy more than a lie. And him? He listened to me, but he wouldn't budge. So I went to the greenhouse that night, Not to kill him, I swear, just to convince him one last time. He'd already prepared the envelope with the evidence. He said he'd send it to Paris, that at least someone had to tell the truth. We had an argument, and then he took the tea that was on the table. He fell seconds later. I didn't understand what was happening. I screamed. I ran. I didn't know I was going to die. Poirot approached slowly. And what did you do with the envelope? Daphne pulled a sealed, untouched envelope from her bag. I hid it, but I couldn't destroy it. It was the last thing he wrote. Poirot took it delicately. What did it contain? Photographs of the frame, copies of Clara's letters, the line, comparison proofs, everything. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you, mademoiselle, you were honest. I don't blame you for being afraid, just for being silent. Daphne looked up with red eyes. So they'll arrest me. Poirot shook his head gently. It wasn't you who poisoned him. But it was you who allowed the death to be complete by hiding the truth. I'm not justice. That's the law's job. What was my job was to restore the picture of truth. He turned to Hastings, who was waiting in the doorway. My friend, tomorrow we will take the voice of nobody to the main hall. It will hang next to Harold's last portrait. Not out of revenge, out of balance. And what will Lady Eugenia say? He will say what history always says when it is forced to include the forgotten. Will say little, but will no longer be able to erase anything. That evening, as silence returned to Winterly Hall, Poirot looked at Clara's self-portrait for the last time. In Chirua, the dim light, her faceless figure seemed to acquire presence, as if, after all, someone was finally listening to her. Chapter 9. Where the Signature Ends. Dawn filtered in golden beams through the stained-glass windows of the main gallery. The drawing-room was still empty when Poirot and Hastings entered with measured steps. In their hands, carefully wrapped in ivory linen, was the painting. The voice of nobody. It seemed to beat with a pulse of its own, as if the silence of decades now whispered from the canvas. Are you sure about this, Poirot? Hastings asked, his voice barely a murmur between the high walls. I don't think Lady Eugenie is ready for what this painting represents. Truth doesn't wait for hearts to be ready, mon ami, Poirot replied. It comes when it should, like justice, like death. With a ceremonial gesture, the detective hung the painting in the central section of the gallery, where it had previously been. The Crimson Whisper. The empty frame of the faded painting now lay to the side like a silent relic. Poirot stepped back a few steps and looked around. A painting that was erased, another that was hidden, and a signature that unites both silences. Do you notice the balance, Hastings? Between lies and reparation? Between what was seen and what was denied? Hours later, Lady Eugenia Winterly entered the drawing-room, flanked by Inspector Mallory and young Daphne. Her face was stoically pale. She didn't ask for explanations. She didn't raise her voice. So this is the picture everyone was afraid of, he said, looking at it closely. Poirot stepped forward, hands folded. It's not just a painting, madam. It's Clara's voice, ignored for years. And the reason that led Rupert Dane to his death. Lionel Grey altered the Crimson Whisper to discredit him, but it didn't kill him. The poison came through another means, and according to the coroner's final report, it was a compound that must have been administered indirectly, perhaps through a contaminated utensil, perhaps by someone who didn't even know what they were doing. Lady Eugenie did not react immediately. "Radis, you saying it was an accident? I'm saying it was too complex a cover-up to be pure chance. But I'm also saying there wasn't enough premeditation to charge Mademoiselle Daphne with murder, at least not without a confession. The legal case against her would be weak. However, Lady Eugenie interrupted, her voice firm, the damage is done. Harold's reputation, this house's, this family's, everything has changed." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but now it can begin to be repaired, not with denial, but with recognition." Lady Eugenie approached the painting very slowly, her eyes grey as worn steel, fixed on the faceless figure. And for a moment something in her seemed to break. Clara was pure fire, he whispered, and Harold, unable to bear it, covered it up with prestigious canvases. I allowed it. Out of fear, out of silence. I won't do it again. Then he turned to Daphne. "You've made mistakes, child, but you are the blood of this house. And if we're going to reclaim the Winterly name, we'll do so by including those who truly bore it, even if they were silenced." Daphne nodded, tears sniffing back, while Hastings silently cleaned his glasses. That evening, Poirot returned to his room with a slow but steady pace. He opened his suitcase, sorted through his accumulated mail, and allowed himself a moment of rest. Hastings, as always, sat in the chair by the window, still processing what had happened. "Do you think it was fair, Poirot? Absolute justice is a rare creature, Hastings. But today we've achieved something even more valuable. A restoration. From the painting of the soul of a house, of a surname, and of a forgotten woman who, at last, has been heard." There was a long silence. Then Hastings, with a weary smile, murmured, "I never thought the most powerful signature in this case would be that of someone who didn't sign anything while alive." Poirot closed his eyes, satisfied. "Ah, but it's just that, my friend." Though most lasting signatures are those that time cannot erase. Chapter 10. The Framework of Truth. Poirot's last day at Winterly Hall dawned with a different air. As if the walls had breathed a long sigh during the night, the past storms, visible or not, had begun to subside. The gallery, now presided over by the voice of nobody, was no longer just a temple to the art of Harold Winterly, but also a space where Clara's memory breathed, alive among the broken silences. Poirot meticulously packed his things. Every crease in his suit, every spare button, every document folded with pinpoint accuracy. Hastings watched him from the doorway, his expression serene, but thoughtful. "You seem more satisfied than usual, Poirot." "That's true, my friend," he replied with a faint smile. "Not for having caught a criminal, but for having revealed a truth. And that, believe me, is rarer." "Do you think Daphne will carry this with her for the rest of her life?" Poirot paused as he aligned his leather gloves. "Absolutely. But it will also serve as a torch. Sometimes mistakes, if acknowledged sincerely, are the only framework on which learning can be anchored." Hastings smiled. That phrase deserves a place next to the painting. Before leaving, Poirot requested a final meeting in the small drawing-room in the West Wing. Present were Lady Eugenie, Daphne, Inspector Mallory, and Alton Finch. In the centre of the table lay 3 objects: the photographic copy of the stretcher signed by Clara, the envelope containing the evidence gathered by Rupert Dane, and a sealed invitation. Poirot spoke in a measured but firm voice. What happened here was a crime, yes, but it was also a conspiracy of time and pride. The murder of Rupert Dane was made possible not only by the direct action of one person, but by the inaction of several. Lionel Grey carried out sabotage, there's no doubt about that, but the climate that allowed his death was cultivated for years. Inspector Mallory nodded gravely. And formal justice. What will it do with Daphne? The investigation found no trace of the poison on her hands, nor conclusive evidence of direct involvement. Only the concealment of the envelope. Poirot intervened. If you choose to prosecute her, the case could be mired in technicalities and ambiguity. My recommendation is otherwise. Which one? Lady Eugenie asked. Poirot took the invitation from the centre and offered it to Daphne. An official retrospective of Clara Annabel Winterly at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Alton Finch has already contacted the curators. His role will be to curate the exhibition, write the catalogue, and write the prologue. His voice will be the one that brings Clara back to the world, and in doing so, settles a debt. Daphne, visibly excited, took the envelope with both hands. I don't know if I'm ready. That's what they said about Clara all her life, Poirot interrupted gently. And yet here she is. Her work has lived on. Lady, Eugenie looked at her niece with an expression of resigned acceptance. Do it right. Not for me, not for Harold, but for yourself. Poirot nodded, satisfied. His work was done. Shortly afterwards, in the car driving away from the estate, Hastings looked out the window at the fields stretching out behind Winterly Hall. You know, Poirot, this time I don't feel like anyone's won. It's just that the curtain has fallen. Poirot thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes, Hastings, it's not about winning. It's about restoring. The frame we found in this case was empty, but the space it left spoke louder than any painting. It was a hollow in the shape of a woman, an artist, a sister, and Rupert Dane, who was perhaps not a great man, had the courage to point it out. Hastings sighed. And Clara's painting, will they allow it to be displayed in public? Yes, and that's justice, not perfect, but enough. He remained silent for a few more seconds. Then, in an almost melancholic voice, he added, There's something beautiful about a forgotten painting that finally finds its frame. Because that's, deep down, what we're all looking for. A place to fit in. A place to be seen, even if it's too late. The car disappeared around the curve, while the last rays of the sun bathed the empty frame hanging next to the recovered portrait. And at Winterly Hall, finally, every stroke was in its place. Epilogue. The Echo of Recovered Colour. The Musée des Beaux-Arts. In Paris, under the winter light of a serene afternoon, had transformed into a symphony of murmurs and soft footsteps. Visitors, art critics, collectors, restorers, and members of the press crowded in the newly opened silenced art wing, whose centerpiece was an unprecedented retrospective. Clara Annabel Winterly, The Voice That Didn't Paint. Pinkel. The paintings, now perfectly restored and mounted in noble dark oak frames, was the self-portrait discovered in the cabin, as well as The Voice of Nobody, exhibited with a discreet curatorial note, hidden since 1910. Discovered and restored after Fafouras, an independent investigation led by Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. In the heart of the gallery, a young woman in a pearl grey dress quietly read an introduction to a respectfully silent crowd. Clara Annabel Winterly didn't sign her works with ink or laurels. Her signature was an imposed oblivion. Today, colour returns not only to her paintings, but to her name. Today, history repairs an incomplete line. Daphne Winterly lowered her gaze humbly as a discreet round of applause filled the room. Not triumphant applause, but heartfelt. In the front rows, Alton Finch nodded approvingly. In the back, a couple of visitors silently watched a perfectly dressed gentleman with a moustache who wasn't part of the official event. "Should we tell him he's here?" an assistant whispered to the curator. "No need. He never comes for praise," Finch replied, flashing a smile. "If he's watching, he'll be leaving." In a small café overlooking the Seine, Poirot was meditatively stirring his cup of hot chocolate. Hastings, a folded newspaper in his lap, looked up. "The exhibition has been a success. Even Le Figaro," he praised it as an act of pictorial justice. "Yes," Poirot replied absently. "And yet it's not justice that interests me most today. It's reparation." "The difference?" Poirot raised a finger. "Justice punishes. Reparation heals. And in this story, the guilt wasn't a knife crime, but a silent one. The most subtle weapon." Hastings nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think Rupert Dane is now remembered as he deserves?" Poirot took a sip before answering. "Rupert wasn't a genius, nor was he a perfect martyr, but he was a man with a principle. And that, Hastings, in this world of ambition and indulgence, is already heroic. His name, like Clara's, is now part of something bigger than both of them, the truth exposed without the need for scandal." A waiter left the bill. Poirot examined it meticulously before leaving a few coins and gently rising. "And now?" Hastings asked, buttoning his coat. "Now we go home. There are other silenced voices, other empty frames waiting to be filled. And you never know, mon ami, what truths might be hidden beneath layers of paint or of courtesy." As the train departed for London at dusk, an envelope forgotten inside the compartment fell onto the seat. Poirot picked it up and examined it. There was no return address, just one handwritten line in French. "There's another painting, not of Clara, of someone who made her disappear." Poirot held it between his neat fingers. His face hardened for a moment. "Ah," he whispered, "so history hasn't hung its last frame yet." Hastings looked at him in surprise. Another painting, another story, another crime, maybe one yet to be discovered. And so, as the locomotive devoured miles of track under the purple sky, Hercule Poirot leaned back in his seat, ready to listen to the voice of a new silence. Chapter 11. The Line That Didn't Match. The letter remained for hours on the small table in the compartment, its ivory envelope barely trembling with the rattle of the train leaving Paris. Poirot didn't rush to open it. As always, patience was his most faithful ally. "Aren't you going to read it, Poirot?" Hastings asked with restrained impatience. "If anyone mentions a new painting, and one linked to a disappearance, no less—" "Ah, mon ami," interrupted Poirot, without taking his eyes off the window. "Haste is the enemy of observation. This letter was not written with urgency, but with calculation. The kind of strokes reserved for messages that are meant to remain, not for those meant to alert. Finally, he opened it. Inside, a plain sheet of paper without a letterhead. The ink was sepia, the handwriting fine and angular, as if engraved rather than written. The contents were brief. "If you want to understand the disappearance of Clara, Annabel Winterly, look for the portrait that wasn't signed. Not the one that hung in the cottage, but the one that refused to be finished. It's in Monet, in L.V.'s private collection." Poirot reread it 3 times. "Monet," he repeated in a low voice. "A coastal town near Dieppe. A retreat for certain discreet collectors. And L.V., who could that be?" Hastings, still following the train of thought, intervened. "Louis Verneau, the eccentric dealer. Isn't he the one who bought part of Winterly's collection after her death?" "Exactly." Poirot tapped the envelope gently with his index finger. "Verneau acquired a lot of works at an auction in 1912, where some works attributed to Harold were sold, but he never mentioned having any incomplete works. If he now has a portrait that Clara left unsigned, could there be anything incriminating about it? Or a reason for making her disappear?" Hastings paled. "Are you implying that Clara didn't die of illness? That her death was also rearranged?" Poirot nodded gravely. "I was always intrigued by the speed with which his case was closed. No autopsy, no public ceremony, no exact date of death recorded. He simply said he died during the winter of 1911, according to Harold's memoirs." Hastings looked out the window. "And what do we do now?" Poirot straightened resolutely. "Change trains." Hours later, the landscape before them was completely different. A cliff crowned by a Baroque mansion with dark windows and wild vegetation. It was the Villa Véronique, owned by Louis Verneau, according to the town postman. Verneau himself was a man of indeterminate age, with translucent skin and a voice as soft as the pages of an old book. He welcomed them into his study, surrounded by cubist sculptures and clocks that kept telling the wrong time. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as if he'd been waiting, "have you come for the unsigned painting?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You see, I don't even need to introduce myself. Men like you don't need cards. Your reputation precedes you. Do you want to see him?" He led them into a smaller room, where dust formed a sacred layer over everything. On a side wall, hanging between 2 unimportant portraits, was the canvas. It was unmistakably Clara Winterly's style, a female figure seated in front of a mirror. But the mirror was empty. There was no reflection. And in the lower right corner, an interrupted signature. Poirot took a step forward. The figure's eyes were barely outlined, yet the gaze held a gripping intensity that was almost painful. The atmosphere around the painting was dense and restrained. This painting was withdrawn before it was completed. Verneux said, his voice low. I bought it without knowing it was Clara's. It was offered to me as an unfinished study of Harold, but I recognized it. She didn't sign it, because someone wouldn't let her. Hastings looked towards the merchant. Who offered it to you? Verneux shrugged. A middleman, anonymous, paid not to ask any questions. But there's something you might be more interested in. He took a folder out of a drawer and handed it to Poirot. Inside was a crumpled letter. The ink was red, more of a whisper than a scream. The last time I saw Clara, she was holding this painting. She said that if Harold didn't let her sign it, she'd destroy it. She never returned to the house. She never painted again. And no one, neither Eugenia nor Colonel Wilton, said a word. The signature was blurry, but legible enough. C. Harper. Poirot closed the folder with a grim expression. Cordelia Harper, the family friend who didn't remember Clara well, the one who evaded all questioning with evasive deliberations. Clearly, she saw more than she admitted. Hastings. Someone else at Winterly Hall knew how to shut Clara up. Do you think his death was a cover-up murder? Poirot looked once more at the unsigned painting. I think this interrupted line is a call from the past, and I can't ignore it. He turned to Verneux. Sir, I need to take this painting with me. It's the only missing voice in the case we thought was closed. Verneux nodded without hesitation. Levelot, I only ask you one thing, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, when you know the truth, hang her. Chapter 12. The Winter That Never Ended. The return to England was silent. Poirot didn't sleep the entire journey. Clara's unfinished canvas, wrapped in black velvet and leaning against the compartment wall, seemed to radiate an uneasy stillness. Hastings, still intrigued by the letter signed Cordelia Harper, flipped through the case notes with growing anxiety. Poirot, why don't we question her first? Cordelia Harper has been there from the beginning, like a weightless shadow. Precisely for that reason, mon ami, said Poirot, without taking his eyes off the fogged-up window. Because she behaved like all people who have something to hide, neither too evasive nor too committed, just absent, like someone who doesn't want to remember something they do remember. Do you think he witnessed the crime? No, Hastings. I think it was passive accomplice in the cover-up. And what will we do? Poirot straightened his body and gently pressed his fingers on the edge of the seat. Let's go to Winterly Hall. One last time. The mansion seemed greyer than ever. The recent calm following the Paris exhibition had settled like fine dust on the walls. Lady Eugénie received them in the gallery, where the painting still hung, the voice of nobody, now with a new plate underneath. Recovered by Hercule Poirot, displayed by Daphne Winterly, signed by history. Monsieur Poirot, hadn't you already finished your work? I thought so, madame, replied Poirot, until a letter from one of your friends told me otherwise. Eugenia tensed. Before she could ask, Cordelia Harper entered the room, elegantly dressed, with the composure of someone who has lived among tea-rooms and diplomatic funerals. Are you referring to me, Monsieur Poirot? Indeed, madame. I'm afraid the time has come to reveal the final truth. He walked to the centre of the gallery and unrolled the new painting in front of everyone. the unfinished canvas, the woman in front of the empty mirror, the interrupted stroke. There was a murmur from Daphne, almost imperceptible. He painted it the week she disappeared. Poirot turned to Cordelia. According to your letter, you were the last person to see her with this painting. Where did that happen? Cordelia didn't respond. Hastings took a step forward. Madam Harper, Rupert died for this truth. We're not asking for justice in court. We're asking for clarity, out of respect for Clara and for yourself. Cordelia closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was an old resigned shadow in them. It was on the southern cliffs. Clara was upset. She screamed that she would destroy the painting, that Harold would never let her sign it. I begged her not to. She was laughing and crying. She held the canvas as if it were a dead child. He turned slowly towards Lady Eugenia. And you knew where it was. You sent Archibald. An icy silence fell over the room. Lady Eugenia remained motionless. He didn't kill her. He just brought her back, but not home, to the cabin. She was sedated. She didn't wake up until the next night. And when she did, she was gone. No one knew where. We didn't ask. We decided she'd vanished. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. And there was never a death certificate. No, Eugenia said, as if uttering a sacrilege. Just an agreement. Harold never knew everything, or never wanted to know. And when he died, we buried him with the secret. Daphne looked at her aunt with a mixture of horror and pity. What if Clara were still alive? Poirot raised Vernolt's letter. I doubt it, mademoiselle. No echo can survive that long without fading. But this painting, this incomplete line, is his testament. It is his interrupted signature. And now, at last, it must be completed. Poirot took an antique ivory-handled quill pen from his pocket. With a solemn gesture, he placed it on the easel next to the canvas. Daphne Winterly, you are the heir, the restorer, the final voice. Complete what she couldn't. Daphne trembled but took the pen. With a firm hand in the lower right corner of the canvas, she wrote in clear handwriting, Clara Annabel Winterly. The signature gleamed for a moment in the light filtering through the window. It wasn't perfect, but it was visible, and it was true. That evening, Poirot and Hastings retired in silence. In the garden, the jasmines were beginning to bloom prematurely, as if winter had finally ended. What do you think now, Poirot? I think, my friend, that justice doesn't always come as a sentence, but as redemption. Not all frames are made to enclose a crime. Some are made to liberate memories. Hastings smiled, and they both walked away as the lights of Winterly Hall flickered one by one like final brushstrokes on a canvas that was no longer afraid of being seen. Chapter 13. The Last Pigment. Days after. The final revelation at Winterly Hall, London woke up under a thick layer of clouds. The London fog curled between the streetlights and rooftops, as if the air still held unrevealed secrets. At 14 Faraway Street, Poirot's apartment looked tidier than usual, which in his case meant absolutely spotless. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. A new painting. It had been hung that morning over the mantelpiece. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was Clara Winterly's self-portrait, now restored, firmly signed. And yet it had a disconcerting quality. The figure still seemed faceless, and yet it conveyed more identity than the most perfect portraits. Hastings, standing with a cup of tea, contemplated her in silence. "I still find it disturbing, Poirot, that eyeless stare, as if he were seeing us through the fabric. Why did you hang it here?" Poirot, sitting cross-legged with a pashmina over his shoulders, answered without looking at the painting. "Because this is a story that shouldn't be closed behind a door. It should be hung up, as truths do, in plain sight, for anyone who dares to look." Hastings drank in silence. Then he frowned. "There's something that's still bothering me. Louis Verneux's letter. He said Clara was talking about someone else, someone who made her disappear. We never confirmed whether it was Lady Eugénie who gave that order, or whether Clara actually died." Poirot closed his eyes as if he had been expecting just that remark. "Very well, Hastings, because, in fact, not everything was revealed, and I wasn't completely truthful. With me, with everyone. With me, too, in a way. But the timing wasn't right." Poirot stood up and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. He took out an envelope sealed with white wax. He placed it in front of Hastings. "This letter arrived the day after we hung the final signature at Winterly Hall. Not from Paris. From Ireland." Hastings raised his eyebrows. "Ireland?" Poirot nodded. "A convent in Cork, Sister Superior Philomena, wrote delicately but bluntly. An anonymous benefactor had been paying the upkeep of an unregistered resident for over 20 years. No name, no past, deaf, mute, artist. She signed only with a C. Hastings took a step back. Clara? I don't know for sure. But they attached a drawing, just one, small, hand-drawn, unsigned. And yet Poirot took a carefully protected sheet of paper from a folder. Inside, a forest seen from a window, and in the background, a stone house. It was Winterly Hall, but it was covered in snow up to the roof, buried in white. "Do you see the detail, Hastings?" Poirot whispered. "There are no footprints in the snow, as if no one had come in, as if no one had come out, as if that whole story were frozen in your memory." Hastings didn't know what to say. "What will you do now?" "Nothing," Poirot replied tenderly. "Sometimes justice isn't bringing someone to justice or revealing every shadow. Sometimes it's protecting those who survived, those who hid not out of cowardice, but because the world didn't listen to them." The hall clock struck the hour. Poirot turned towards the portrait. She wanted to disappear, and maybe, for once in her life, we should allow her the right to be invisible. That night, while London slept, Poirot wrote one last note. He slipped it into an envelope marked D.W. and left it on the tea-table. It simply said, "Clara's work doesn't end where she signs. It ends where you decide yours begins." The echo of that phrase, like the final pigment that completes a painting, lingered in the air. And though the brushes were dry and the frames hung, Poirot knew, as always, that the truth is not closed, it is exposed. Chapter 14. The colour that doesn't dry a week later. Spring seemed to have begun its timid march through London. The squares were blooming with hesitant daffodils, and the cafes of Soho were beginning to open their terraces, as if the city, after a long lethargy, had once again decided to look outward. However, in Poirot's apartment, the curtains were still, carefully aligned, the windows closed, and the atmosphere was charged with something Hastings couldn't quite identify. "Are you still thinking about the letter from the convent, Poirot?" she asked, flipping through the newspaper without really reading it. Poirot, sitting with his hands clasped in his lap, did not reply immediately. "No, Hastings, I'm thinking of something more subtle. Something that wasn't written, but was painted." He stood up and walked over to the portrait of Clara Winterly, the same one that had hung above the fireplace. Silently, he delicately removed the frame and, with the tip of a conservation knife, began to examine the back of the canvas. "What are you doing?" "There's a custom among certain artists," Poirot said, "when a work can't be fully expressed from the front. A final message is hidden on the back, not as a revelation, but as a warning, or confession." With precise movements he peeled off a thin layer of paper attached to the canvas backing. Beneath it a small piece of fabric was sewn into a pocket. Inside, carefully folded, was a yellowish piece of paper. Poirot took it out and unfolded it. The writing was the same as Clara's. "Sketches, sloping, tense, urgent." It said, "If anyone finds this, don't look for me. I'm alive, but not as you wish. My face was denied, so I denied it too. If Harold dies before me, let me disappear with your silence." Poirot lowered the note slowly. "Hastings, she didn't just escape. She chose to erase herself, not out of fear, but as a gesture of protest. She turned her disappearance into the ultimate artistic act. But then, why leave this message? Why allow it to be discovered? Because every artist needs at least look that understands what he did. Clara didn't want recognition, but she did want understanding. This message isn't for the world. It's for anyone with the courage to look behind the painting, to step into the distance." Hastings swallowed. "And now what will we do?" Poirot turned to him, the letter still in his hand. "Now, nothing. We'll keep it. But if one day someone, perhaps a new curator, perhaps Daphne, wonders why Clara disappeared, they'll know that she herself was the firm that refused to dry, not out of cowardice, out of choice." There was a soft knock at the door. Poirot went to open it. It was a messenger. He carried a navy blue envelope stamped with the seal of the Museum of Fine Arts in Paris. Poirot opened it carefully. It was an invitation, not to an exhibition, but to a symposium. "The Women Who Disappeared from Art, Clara Winterly and Other Broken Signatures. Guest speaker, Daphne Winterly. Closing moderator, Hercule Poirot, Hastings Silbo." Wow, that's more than justice. It's vindication. Poirot smiled at last. It's the colour that never dried, the pigment that survived the silence. He placed the letter next to the portrait. Then he returned to his seat, like someone closing a chapter, not with words, but with a definitive pause. In a Parisian gallery weeks later, Clara's incomplete face would hang among others. Nameless women, artists signed by others, works attributed to shadows. But this time, beneath each one, a uniform sign, authorship restored by eyes that never stopped looking. And in a corner, sitting with his ivory cane and his perfect moustache, Poirot, silently observing how little by little colour finally found its place. Chapter 15. The Traces Under the Paint. The room was full, but the silence was absolute. Daphne. Winterly held the microphone, her fingers barely trembling. In front of her, an expectant audience. Renowned critics, art historians, women's heritage activists, and influential collectors from across the continent. To her right, sitting discreetly in the front row, were Alton Finch and, of course, Hercule Poirot. The moderator had already opened the presentation. Now it was all up to her voice. My Aunt Clara didn't disappear because she was sick, nor because history didn't have room for her. She disappeared because art was a place where women didn't sign their names, or rather, signed for others. A respectful murmur crossed the room. For years, I believed that a signature on a painting was a mark of authorship. But I learned through the work of Rupert Dane and the guidance of Monsieur Poirot that signature can also be a testimony, or an intentional omission, a broken mark, an act of resistance. He sighed briefly and held up a copy of Clara's unfinished portrait, the same one Poirot had found in Mornay. This painting isn't incomplete. It's waiting for something. Not her signature, which has already been restored, but our gaze. Her reflection in the empty mirror. Because Clara didn't paint herself. She painted the absence that we all share when someone is erased. A slow applause rose, not raucous, not triumphant, just profound. After the event, Poirot avoided the usual cocktail party. He preferred the fresh air of the museum courtyard, among silent sculptures and a muted fountain. Hastings found him there, as always, perfectly erect, his hands clasped behind his back. You should have stayed, Poirot. There were lemon cakes, and one of the curators offered to dedicate his new book to you. Thank you, my friend, but today wasn't my day to shine. It was Clara's day, and Daphne's. Yes, although she doesn't know it yet, Daphne has signed her first painting. Not with a brush, but with her voice. Poirot turned to him, his eyes shining with carefully restrained emotion. Do you remember the opening scene, Hastings? The Crimson Whisper. The one who seemed to have lost all his colour. What if I told you that he hadn't lost it, but that he withdrew it on purpose? Hastings blinked. Did you remove the pigment? No. The final varnish, the protective filter that gives depth to the colour. A skilled restorer can do that. Why? To force a later restoration, and in that process make visible what was previously hidden. Hastings stepped forward, intrigued. Are you saying that Rupert... Exactly. Rupert wasn't a naive victim. He was a strategist. He knew he wouldn't live to see the outcome, but the painting is purposely naked, stripped of the varnish. X-ray analysis revealed Clara's original signature. It was her way of shouting what everyone else had kept quiet. So, was it your last work? It was his last restoration, and perhaps his bravest act. Poirot took a newspaper clipping out of his pocket, a headline from an alternative art journal. Rupert Dane, the restorer who brought colour back to history. Poirot folded it carefully. No one else will know how much he risked, but we will. That evening, back at his Parisian hotel, Poirot looked out from his window at the glittering city. The Seine reflected lights as if each one were a moving brushstroke. On his desk lay an unopened letter, marked with the initials EW on the return address. Gently, he opened it. It was Lady Eugenia's. Monsieur Poirot, I saw the portrait hanging in the museum gallery. Clara would have hated it all. The lights, the speeches, the sudden devotion. But perhaps, for the first time, we would have understood her. You taught me that the truth doesn't always absolve us, but it does reveal us. Thank you for giving me back a sister, even if it's too late. Poirot folded it and placed it under his empty crystal glass. Then he sat down, closed his eyes and murmured, History is also restored. Brushstroke by brushstroke, signature by signature, lie by lie. And that night, in her dream, there was no crime, just a woman sitting in front of a mirror, this time with a face and colour. Chapter 16. The Room Where No One Signed. 2 months after the Paris exhibition, the Museum of Subaltern, Art in Vienna, a quiet but respected institution for its devotion to invisible works, contacted Poirot directly. The letter was courteous, handwritten by the director, Dr. Hedda Baumgarten, and referred to a mysterious painting that had appeared among an anonymous donation, an untitled, unsigned work with no clear provenance, but with features disturbingly similar to those of Clara Winterly. The letter, without asking for it directly, begged for help. You see, Hastings, said Poirot, placing the note on the breakfast table, when a truth is unearthed, a crack is released, and from that crack, like water from a spring, others begin to emerge. Do you mean someone is trying to continue the story, or finish it? Vienna greeted them with an unusually clear sky. The museum's private room, where conservators used to analyze donated works before classifying them, was a mixture of order and chaos. Precisely labelled jars, brushes filed by thickness, and white light filtered through rice paper. Dr. Baumgarten, a tall, bony woman with the bearing of someone who has spent decades among pigments and secrets, led them to a locked room. We found it 4 weeks ago, unframed, untitled, not a single signature, but take a look for yourself. The painting, carefully placed on a cloth support, was dark. Even more so than the voice of nobody, it was almost a shadow. It represented a windowless room, and in it a figure sitting at a desk. But the most disturbing thing was that the desk was empty. No pen, no paper, just an unlit lamp. What do you suggest, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot approached without touching it. He bent down and examined the lines. It suggests that someone wanted to paint the impossibility of leaving a tracer room where you write, but don't sign. Hastings frowned. And you think it's Clara's? Poirot didn't reply immediately. Then he pointed to the lower left corner. Very barely visible, in varnish barely different from the background, was a silhouette traced with infinite patience. A wheeled paddle. That mark, said Poirot, is not a signature. It's a farewell. That night in his room at the Hotel Sacher, Poirot spread out on the bed various clippings of letters, photographs, sketches by Clara, and fragments of reports about collections that had disappeared after the war. Hastings approached sleepily. Are you still doing this? My friend, there's something else here. Do you remember the report Daphne once mentioned? that Harold had, in his early years, a private group of artists with whom he exchanged techniques. He called them the Silent Mirror, didn't he? Exactly. It was thought there were only 3 people. But this painting suggests there was a 4th. A presence that left no signature, no testimony, except the echo of the void. Poirot pointed to a small piece of paper dated 1907, an informal invitation to a private exhibition in the south of France. 4 names were crossed out. One of them was illegible. Only an initial was visible before, the obliterated line C. What if it wasn't Clara who painted this work? Poirot murmured. What if it was someone who knew her, who protected her, or who was silenced by her? Hastings straightened. Are you suggesting an imitator, a disciple, or an accomplice? Remember what Lady Eugenia said. Clara didn't die. She disappeared. But did someone help her disappear to preserve her last work? This painting isn't just anonymous. It's a capsule. Poirot turned to him with an expression Hastings already knew well. It wasn't that of a detective. It was that of a man who saw a truth coming from the fog. This painting was painted for someone, not to be seen, but Taube found. The next day, infrared analysis carried out by the museum's laboratory revealed what Poirot suspected. Beneath the layer of darker pigment, hidden at the base of the desk depicted on the canvas, was a line written in dry oil paint, invisible to the human eye. When you see this room, look in the other one, where the window was boarded up and signing wasn't allowed. Poirot laid the report on the table with a calculated gesture. Hastings, pack your bags. Again. We're going back to Winterly Hall. But why? Poirot replied as he folded his gloves with absolute precision. Because Clara didn't leave one last painting. He left one last room. And this story, Hastings, still has not hung his last painting. Chapter 17. The boarded-up window, the afternoon, was grey when Poirot and Hastings arrived back at Winterly Hall. The mansion, bathed in the leaden light of the British sky, seemed less imposing than before, as if the truth revealed months before had diminished its weight, not in dignity, but in concealment. And yet, the detective knew, the most important thing had not yet come to light. Lady Eugenie greeted them with less ceremony than the previous time, although her voice was still as precise as her hairstyle. Here again, Monsieur Poirot. I thought Clara's story was over. With the facts, perhaps, but not with the places, madam. What do you mean? Clara left one last hint, Poirot said with imperturbable courtesy. And not in words. In a painting, found in Vienna. Hidden beneath layers of paint was a clear message. Look for the room where the window was boarded up. Eugenia stood still for a moment. All the rooms have been registered. None have been structurally altered since the war. Are you sure about that? Hastings asked, looking around. Even the hallways in the north wing look like they haven't been used in decades. That wing has been closed since Harold died. The rooms were left as they were. It's an unproductive wing. Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed a long-held suspicion. Then I'd appreciate it if you'd let us review it. One last time. The procession entered the corridors of the north wing. Daphne, now accompanying Poirot as a sort of chronicler and moral heir, held a lantern as they advanced through dusty corridors, covered in fabric and redolent of old wood. Hastings opened doors while Poirot observed not the walls, but the silence. "There are no windows here," Hastings said, "just panels." "Exactly," replied Poirot, stopping in front of a double door at the end of the corridor. "This room used to be a reading study, didn't it? The layout suggests it must have received direct light." Lady Eugenia, a few steps behind, did not respond. Poirot pushed open the doors. The room was intact, covered with pillowcases. But something didn't add up. On the east wall, 3 bookshelves covered the entire wall. Poirot approached, felt the back of the wood. "New wood," he whispered, "cut differently from the rest of the room. Listen." He knocked. A hollow sound. A panel. Behind it, not stucco, but brick, irregular, rough. This was walled up. From the inside, Poirot turned to Eugenia. "Madam, may I remove these shelves?" Eugenia finally lowered her gaze. "It was my idea," he said. "Harold ordered it, yes, but I was the one who hired the workers. He said the direct light damaged the pigments. Actually, he couldn't stand Clara working there. It was her studio before his. She used it once when he was in Paris." Poirot nodded gravely. Clara didn't paint to be seen. She painted so that she couldn't be ignored, and so, when she felt silenced, turned this room into his final canvas. Daphne approached with the flashlight, and together with Hastings, they began to carefully move the shelves. Behind them, the bricks clearly revealed a superimposed structure. A window, yes, boarded up, but not without traces. Poirot called for a chisel and with careful movements removed a layer of plaster. Underneath, the original glass wasn't there, but what looked like a layer of varnished wood was there, and painted from within. "Oh, my God!" Daphne murmured. "It's a mural." "A hidden fresco," Poirot confirmed. "Clara painted it on the back of the window before it was sealed, her final testament. With the help of a damp sponge, they removed dust and sediment. And then it appeared. A female figure from behind, identical to the voice of nobody, sitting in front of a window, looking out into an unseen exterior. But in the painting, unlike the real world, the window was open. Beyond, a hill of poppies, a bright sky, and above the frame, painted as if floating among the clouds, a simple line, "I did sign here," and at the bottom, for the first and last time, with a firm crimson stroke, "Clara Annabel Winterly." No one spoke for several minutes. Daphne broke the silence with a broken voice. She painted a way out, for herself, for everyone. Poirot placed his hand on the frame of the painting. A painting that can't be moved, that can't be bought or hung. Just look at each other. Eugenia, in the background, leaned against the wall. She wasn't crying, but her face was different. A tired one. Human. "I should have left that window open." Poirot replied without harshness. "But now it is, madam." Finally. Hours later, while the mural was being documented by urgently summoned restorers, Poirot wrote a single sentence in his personal notebook. The crime was silence. The punishment, oblivion. Justice, looking where no one wants to look. Then he closed the notebook, put on his hat, and said to Hastings, "Come on, my friend, this case, like the room, already has enough light." Chapter 18. Where the Canvas Ends. Days after the discovery of the feu mural hidden behind the bricked-up window of Winterley Hall, the room that was once sealed forever had become the busiest spot in the mansion, not by curious onlookers or journalists, but by restorers, historians, and silent visitors who walked there like someone approaching a freshly opened grave. But for Poirot, who now observed the mural with the same attention he devoted to human contradictions, this was not a tomb. It was a confession without words. "Hastings," he said quietly, as the two of them stood in the living room, alone at dawn, "what we found isn't a simple painting. It's an act of justice. One that, curiously, didn't require judges or juries, just time, and eyes that knew how to see." Hastings, unpretentiously moved, watched Clara's figure in the fresco. There, where once there had been only shadows, now there was a hill open to the horizon, a signature in red, and a truth that, at last, could not be covered up with silence or bricks. "And to think," he muttered, "that it all began with a painting that had lost its colour. No, my friend, that was just the frame. The real picture was in the souls of those who tried to hide it." Poirot walked slowly across the room. He touched the edge of the old wood that had once covered the window with his fingers. Then he took a folded letter from his coat. "Before we go," he said in a measured tone, "there is one last matter." "Another one?" Poirot held out the letter. It was from the convent in Cork. The Mother Superior had written again. Her tone was more direct this time. "She's gone, our silent resident. She left only one page, a dried flower inside a book, and a name written in pencil on the back cover, Daphne. She told us, using signs, that was her last word." Hastings swallowed. "Do you think it was Clara?" Poirot carefully put the letter away. "I think it was his reflection. The last one. The one that no longer asked to be found. Just remembered." The day Daphne Winterley returned to the mural room, she didn't do so with a group of restorers. She entered alone. Poirot and Hastings saw her from a distance, framed by the door like a figure frozen in time. She stood there for a long time, motionless. Then, without saying anything, she approached the frame of the painting, and he wrote, a pencil line on the edge of the wall, "Thank you for leaving a light on." Back in London, Poirot wrote his final report at his usual desk. He titled it simply, "The Case of the Painting That Forgot Its Colour." Not as a police report, but as a chronicle, a story of disappearance without a body, of murder without blood, of justice without conviction. In it, he not only explained how Rupert Dane had found Clara's hidden signature, how Lionel Gray had altered the painting, and how Daphne hid evidence out of desperation. He also told the most important thing. What the longest crime wasn't an act. It was a tacit agreement, a pact of silence between those who preferred a false legacy to an inconvenient truth. And one by one, those pacts were undone by small actions. A restoration, a confession, an unsigned painting. On the last page of the report, Poirot wrote something he would never give to the police. He would just leave it there, for anyone who read carefully. It said, the mystery was psychological, yes, but also structural. the crime wasn't committed by an individual, but by a culture. And Clara Annabel Winterly wasn't the only victim. She was the only one who dared to paint her protest, where it couldn't be removed. That night, as London fell asleep in the fog, Poirot turned off his lamp, leaned back in his velvet armchair, and closed his eyes. He didn't dream of paintings or signatures. He dreamed of a window and with a woman looking out without fear. Finally,